A student sits motionless, staring at a page they have read 4 times already. Tomorrow morning is the exam, and the material feels familiar, almost obvious. Yet earlier that day, a friend asked a simple question from the same chapter, and the answer vanished. The room is quiet except for the small sound of a pencil tapping against a notebook margin. Why does knowing something during review collapse into silence when the book is closed? The most natural answer hides in plain sight. The material was never truly learned. And the most common fix feels logical. Read it again, underline more, repeat until the words stick. This strategy is called restudying, and it creates a sensation of fluency that mimics mastery. Fluency feels like knowledge because the page becomes comfortable, and the sentences start to predict themselves. But cognitive psychologists discovered a problem sitting at the center of that comfortable feeling. Recognition is not the same as retrieval, and familiarity is not the same as understanding. A student can recognize a concept on the page without being able to produce it from memory. The testing effect is the finding that actively pulling information out of your mind strengthens it more than putting it in again. Retrieval practice, as researchers call it, is not just a way to measure learning, but a way to create it. The student at the desk does not yet know this distinction, and so the evening stretches ahead full of rereading. She pauses, closes the book, and tries to recall a single key term from the chapter without looking. Her mind supplies the beginning of a definition, then stumbles, then offers a related word, then goes blank. The blankness is uncomfortable, and it feels exactly like failure. Most people interpret that discomfort as evidence that they need to study more, not study differently. But here is the first turn. The blankness is not a sign that learning failed to happen. The blankness is a signal that retrieval has not yet been practiced enough to become durable. To understand why, it helps to examine what happens when a memory is formed in the first place. Every memory leaves a trace, a pattern of connections across the cells and systems of the brain. When you learn something new, that trace is fragile, like a path through tall grass that disappears if no one walks it again. Rereading the material is like looking at a photo of the path. Retrieval is like walking the path yourself. Walking the path strengthens it even when the walk is difficult, especially when the walk is difficult. In the laboratory, researchers have compared students who studied a passage once and then reread it repeatedly with students who studied it once and then tried to recall it without notes. When the test came a week later, the retrieval group remembered far more, even though they had not reviewed the material again. The rereading group felt more confident right after studying, but that confidence turned out to be an illusion of fluency. The struggle to retrieve information, even when retrieval fails at first, changes the memory in ways that passive review does not. This is the central mechanism. Retrieval is not a neutral check of a mental file cabinet. Retrieval is a process that rebuilds the memory and makes it more accessible in the future. Think about what happens when the student finally recalls that missing term after a moment of effort. She experiences a brief spike of resolution, a small reward, and the next time she reaches for the same term, the path feels slightly clearer. Psychologists call this desirable difficulty, a challenge during learning that feels effortful in the moment, but improves long-term retention. Not all difficulty is desirable, but difficulty that requires you to reconstruct an idea from partial cues tends to strengthen the memory. That is why simply recognizing a correct answer on a multiple-choice question does not build the same durability as generating the answer yourself. The student at the desk decides to experiment for 10 minutes before returning to her old habits. She writes a question on a blank sheet of paper. What are the 3 stages of memory processing, and what happens at each stage? She stares at the question, looks away, and begins to write in rushed, messy sentences. Her answer is incomplete, and she knows it. but the act of trying changes her relationship to the topic. When she opens the book again, she is not reading passively. She is hunting for the information her retrieval attempt exposed as missing. This transforms rereading from a comfort ritual into a repair strategy targeted at genuine gaps. The testing effect does not mean students should stop reading or listening or discussing ideas. It means that after a first exposure, the most efficient next step is often to close the material and attempt to produce what was learned. The form of that attempt can vary. Flashcards, practice questions, teaching the idea to an empty chair, writing a summary from memory, or simply explaining the concept out loud while walking. In each case, the crucial ingredient is the same. Pull the information from within your own mind before checking whether you were right. One classic classroom study illustrates the counterintuitive power of this shift. A science teacher gave one group of students a standard review session, with the material displayed on slides, and a second group a blank page and a request to write down everything they remembered. When tested a few days later, the students who stared at an empty page and struggled outperformed the students who sat through the polished review. The empty page was not a punishment. It was a practice space, and the struggle was the learning itself. Yet there is a limit to the testing effect that matters deeply for how it should be used. Retrieval practice does not work well if you have never encountered the information before. You cannot retrieve what was never encoded. First exposure still matters, and a good explanation, a clear diagram, or a compelling story can make that first exposure stick. But once something is barely learned, the fastest route to durable knowledge runs through repeated acts of recall. The timing of those recall attempts also shapes the outcome. A single retrieval attempt right after studying helps, but spacing those attempts over days or weeks builds memories that last months or years. Spacing retrieval across time forces the brain to reconstruct knowledge from a weaker signal, and that reconstruction produces the deepest learning. The student at the desk does not yet know about spacing, but she has already stumbled into its first principle. Delay even a few minutes before testing yourself, and the benefit grows. She closes her notebook again, waits for the urge to check her phone to pass, and then writes out the same answer a second time without looking. Her sentences are more complete now, and a detail she missed the first time surfaces on its own. This is another aspect of the testing effect called transfer-appropriate processing. The idea that practice is most effective when it resembles the eventual performance. Studying by rereading is like preparing for a swimming race by watching videos of water. You need to be in the water, struggling against the resistance to build the capacity you will need. Yet many students resist retrieval practice because it feels less productive than more passive methods. The effort required during retrieval gives the false impression that learning is not happening, when in fact it is the engine of learning. Understanding this changes the meaning of the quiet frustration that filled the opening scene. The student's blankness when her friend asked a question was not a verdict on her ability, but a symptom of studying in a way that prioritizes comfort over durable change. The reversal at the center of the testing effect is almost too simple to believe at first. The mental labor that feels like not knowing is often the precise moment when knowing begins to consolidate. This does not mean that every moment of confusion is productive, or that struggling without guidance is always the answer. Desirable difficulty becomes undesirable frustration when the task is completely beyond reach, when feedback never arrives, or when the student believes the struggle means she is broken rather than growing. Feedback is a necessary partner to retrieval practice because retrieving an incorrect answer without correction strengthens the wrong path. Over the next hour, she alternates between short bursts of reading and longer stretches of self-testing. She notices something unexpected. The harder the retrieval feels, the more clearly the idea settles into her memory once she checks the answer. Her confidence is lower than it was when she was simply rereading, but her actual command of the material is growing in ways that confidence cannot yet measure. The testing effect applies far beyond classrooms and textbooks. A friend who recalls the details of a difficult conversation and reflects on what he should have said differently is engaging in social retrieval practice, strengthening the interpersonal lessons for next time. A musician who puts away the sheet music and attempts a piece from memory is using retrieval to turn mechanical repetition into flexible performance. A professional who writes a summary of a meeting from memory before filing the notes is consolidating the information in a form she can actually use later. In each domain, the principle is consistent. Retrieval transforms passive exposure into active possession of knowledge. But the testing effect also carries a caution about how we judge our own learning. Fluency during study inflates predictions of future performance so reliably that researchers call it a metacognitive illusion. Metacognition is the ability to think about your own thinking, and it is easily deceived by a smooth-feeling textbook. The student who feels certain while rereading often overestimates her readiness by a wide margin. The student who struggles during retrieval practice sometimes underestimates her readiness because she confuses effort with failure. That is why the sensation of difficulty during self-testing is not a signal to stop, but a signal that the right kind of work is underway. As evening turns toward night, the student stands up, walks to the kitchen, and explains the stages of memory processing to her mother while gesturing with a spoon. Her mother asks a follow-up question the student did not prepare for, and for a moment the old blankness returns. But this time, the student pauses, thinks, and retrieves enough of the framework to offer a partial answer and a promise to check the rest. The blankness has changed meaning. It is now a road sign rather than a dead end. The testing effect is not a study hack or a shortcut to effortless learning. It is a reminder that durable knowledge grows through a sequence of encounter, retrieval, feedback, and spacing. The effort that feels like not knowing is often the evidence that learning is taking hold beneath the surface of awareness. Every time the student closes the book and attempts to reconstruct what she thinks she knows, she is not testing her memory, but upgrading it. The mind tends to confuse ease with effectiveness, and the testing effect asks for a different kind of trust. Trust that the hard path builds what the easy path only polishes. The next morning, the student walks into the exam and faces a blank page not as a predator, but as an invitation to retrieve what she has already practiced reconstructing dozens of times. The pencil moves and the answers arrive not because she crammed more looking, but because she spent the evening reaching into her own mind and pulling the knowledge into the light.